So I prepared a couple of questions for you. Of course, as you know, with your permission, I also shared your poems with my students earlier this semester in a class in which I taught 18th and 19th century European art history. And my co-editors, Robin Mitchell, Jennifer Hoyer, and I are absolutely thrilled that you submitted your poems to our H-France Salon Special Issue on race and representation in 18th and 19th century Francosphere. And now that I've taught it to my students as well, I prepared a couple of questions for you, and I will use them as sort of beginning of the conversation for the two of us. So I'll start with my first question. What was it that inspired you to write a two-part epic poem about the Chevalier de Saint-Georges and his mother, Nanon? In other words, what was your motivation for creating this work about these two 18th century individuals that very few people have known about?
Well, initially, I was motivated by my son's claim to association with the Chevalier de Saint-Georges and as biracial. And in the entry into the poem, I cited just what he said at the time when I noticed the street name, the plaque on the street in Paris. And Michael said he was a beautiful blend, biracial like me. And that prompted my inquiry into his life. And it was my general interest in biracial offspring that pushed me further into research. I was struck by the location of the street, which carries his name. It's right off the Madeleine in a luxurious section of Paris. And the plaque carries his dates, and we can come back to his dates because there's some confusion about dates, and information identifying him as a musician. I believe it said orchestral director at the time. As I learned more about him, I became intrigued with the information about his talents. As a young man, he was well known as a fencer, a swordsman, and then his career as a musician, as a violinist, as an orchestral conductor, and a composer came to the fore. That I was interested in his music. I began to hear from people who knew of his music. And somebody gave me one of his CD of a violin concerto. Well, then I was even more curious. The research about his birth and his birthplace provided information that led me to his mother, Nanon, a slave, often referred to as La Belle Nanon, and about his father, Georges de Boulogne, a French planter, plantation owner, and slave owner. My maternal grandfather, Henry Willis, who was born in 1875 on Portsmouth Island, North Carolina, was of similar parentage. His mother, Rose, was a slave. His father, Ben Willis, was a small landowner on the island. I wrote a suite of poems about this story, published as a chapbook in 2015 with the title Reclaiming Rose. And it was with that as background and motivation maybe that I decided I wanted to reclaim Nanon. It wasn't enough to recreate her son's life, her famous son. But I wanted to imagine what life, what would have been for her. And I wanted to give her voice and a place in history. And I'm honored that you are giving her that place in your historical work.
It's indeed very striking in this two-part poem that Nanon is the one who actually speaks. You give her the first personal pronoun and she speaks as I, while Joseph Boulogne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, there are very few passages in the poetry where he's directly speaking. I think the only time he directly speaks is when he and his father arrive in Paris and Joseph is startled by the reaction that he receives, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But Nanon, from beginning until the end, is expressing her thoughts, her emotions, and it folds across time, basically. You know, starting in the in the Caribbean and then ending up in among the nuns, right, in France. Yeah. So that's my next question for you. So while Chevalier de Saint-Georges is, of course, a non-historical personage, there's documentation regarding his life and activities from his lifetime onwards. And of course, we also have his musical work as a composer. So, you know, we have some sort of almost physical residues of his inner life in a way, right? The archive is probably fairly silent on Nanon. So did creating Nanon require for you a different kind of process than imagining and creating Joseph, Chevalier de Saint-Georges?
Well, certainly, yes. There is very little factual material about her. I've never seen an image of her. And they're images of Saint-Georges. I had to imagine Nanon, her circumstances, and thought about her in relation to the progress of her son and his extraordinary life. I began by about Guadeloupe in the 18th century, slavery in Guadeloupe, to get a sense of her social position and circumstances before she was transported to France. Her mother is mentioned in some texts by name. It begins with a K. Her name is mentioned. She's mentioned in the poem, and she was a kind of sorcerer. But there's no mention of Nanon's father. And that she's referred to very frequently as La Belle Nanon, and referred to as La Belle Nanon by the French. It suggests to me that she herself was métisse, mixed race, a mulatto. And I have not any specific evidence of that, but that's what I've assumed. And the genetic combination in her son, you know, who was regarded as extremely handsome, um, that combination would render him an interesting mixed race person with the kind of with the features that would make him acceptable and of interest to Paris gentry. As for the process of imagining or creating Nanon, I imagined myself in that situation. I'm personally acquainted with the social and psychological dynamics of interracial marriage. And given my recent relocation, saying goodbye to my country of birth, my native country, and moving to France, I it heightened my awareness of the loneliness of relocating, moving to another culture. She had to have resented being there. I suppose it had a certain appeal, hearing about France, hearing about Paris. But then she's there and she doesn't have access to the Paris she's been told about, you know? She doesn't feel welcomed, I assume. She would have some language issues at first because her French was not the French of Paris, or from what I've read of the kind of welcome and inclusion that her husband made for their son, it placed him in a social category with the sons of nobility in his school, in which she may not have been comfortable. And that's how I began feeling how she must have felt. I became Nanon, not La Belle Nanon, but psychologically, I began to imagine what she must have felt. In the passage, I think it's the section of her crossing made me think about the Middle Passage and the length of a journey on water across the ocean at that time. And it wasn't the kind of transatlantic travel of the 20th or 21st century. And she would have been with traveling with cargo, traveling with passengers that, for various reasons, had to take that kind of passage. A priest, I imagined, and a painter. And her son. And I tried to get across a sense of how that might have felt, the risk, the unpleasantness that surrounded her journey to France. I'm not clear, and I'm not sure about whether she traveled with the other family, and that's not clear in the text, but I put her on board just with herself and her son. It was less complicated in a way. And I don't give space or voice to the other family. I do know that they, when they arrived in France, Georges arranged for them, his wife and daughter, to be housed with or to live with or live on a family estate in Agen. And he had Nanon in a posh section of Paris. Did they go out much together? I don't know. I don't show them promenading. And I imagined her trips out, her sorties were functional, that is, to go to the I don't imagine her I don't imagine her enjoying being there. In the text, a couple of the texts, I read that she entered a convent a few years after her husband died. And I assume whatever support she had for her housing and the rest of her life, which he would have been providing, disappeared when he died. And so a convent was probably her best and maybe only choice. She had been visited by, and I at some point, I'm not sure of what I've read and what I've imagined. Her association with nuns, I think I did actually read that, and a convent was mentioned, and I've found it on records of French convents, and I can see her wanting to be taken care of in the company of sisters. Her anger, which I enjoyed writing because I was angry with George too, isn't reflected in anything that I've read. But she had to have been furious. I mean, just livid about being taken from her people and having her son taken away from her, moved into a social context where she didn't feel welcomed or would not have been welcomed at all. She had to have been very, very, very angry. And in that last passage, and as I think about it, I mean, I get angry with him all over again. So that's how I imagined it. And there was just so little to go on. that much was left to the imagination.
You not only give her roof to spend her final years, but in the, I'm looking at the last section of the poem again, in her, you know, as she discovers the nuns, or as the nuns discover her, in a way she finds solace and she finds acceptance in a way as if she had never found her entire life, because even, you know, even back at home, she wasn't considered to be one of them by the field workers, right? We hear them talk about her and gossip about her and her son. So yes, your imagination gives her, allows her to finally find solace, a place of belonging in the convent.
And circumstances that allow her really to say goodbye. Adieu.
Yeah, right.
What else?
So we're publishing your poetry in the context of the special issue that explores teaching, or how we can teach the representation of race in the art history and history of the 18th and 19th century Francosphere. So here's my question to you. To those college students who may be assigned your poems in the context of a history or an art history class, what would you want to say regarding the role of poetry and creative fiction in giving agency to historical personages whose lived experiences would have been otherwise neglected, silenced, or suppressed by the archive?
Well, I certainly think it's legitimate to lift the individuals who deserve some space and representation in their eras. That question took me to looking into poets who've done such work. And I turned to Robert Hayden, who has written about Nat Turner, Frederick Douglass, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman, in a way that enlarges what we know about them. And there's another writer, Evie Shockley, who has a poem about W.E.B. Du Bois that says something about him and his entire life that would be informative, certainly. I mean, these are figures about which will be biographies written. But what poets and fiction writers can bring to the biographical information is more of a context, maybe social, maybe psychological. I'm a psychologist by training, and I think sometimes what's lost in certain biographies is a sense of how the character felt. And just imagining what the interior monologues, if you will, of some figures might have been while they were performing their places, their works that gained them places in history.